Well, welcome everybody to the program. We're doing this, I think, 7 years later from when we
Wow.
first
Yeah.
sat down back at Western
Mhm.
in Propel.
Yeah.
And you and I have known each other for, I don't even know at this point, like, has it been a decade? Just under a decade.
Just under, yeah.
Yeah.
Like 2015
Uh-huh.
through.
And yeah, as a person, you're a designer, you're an entrepreneur, you're a creator, you're a writer, you're doing all these different things. And one thing I've always noticed about you is that you always have such a keen affinity and aesthetic towards design, and you're always thinking of how to kind of push the boundaries and explore and invent. And I'd love to start off at the beginning, like with Propel and your story, going on to found, like, it would have been Alchemy, selling Alchemy, then starting Clew, selling Clew. So can you tell us a little bit about Udara and where Udara started in his journey?
For sure, yeah. I suppose right from the beginning, I'm from Sri Lanka. I grew up in Sri Lanka for the first 18 odd years of my life. And growing up, my parents were into art. My dad was an engineer, and he'd share like a lot of what he does around the house. He paints on the weekends, and my mom does gardening, and they were just like very creatively oriented people. Like all of the stuff in the house, all of the art, pots, paintings were like either done by them or like me or my sister. So growing up in that infused a lot of side activities and side projects and the stuff we would do outside of like school, outside of work. And I feel like that sort of always has been carried through in like whatever I do. I've always had like interests outside of that, but that has been a part of everything I do in one way or another. And it's something that I care about, like when I work on something, like I care about how it looks, I care about how it feels. That will be the origin of that. So growing up, I was into all of that stuff, but I also had like an interest in science and interest in like biology and genetics to a degree, and computers were something that I like picked up along the way growing up as well. And I at some point there, like I think when I was like 15, 14, I like figured out the internet and figured out like things like forums and talking to people online and like meeting people that like I would otherwise never have met, to be honest.
Where did you spend a lot of time on the forums? Like what forums did you?
Well, it started off with just like a multitude of just random internet forums, just like tech forums. DeviantArt was a big thing. Yeah, like stuff like that, creatively oriented forums, like people working on like magazines, people working on like art projects. Some people were like making little movies by like collecting clips from around the world. And I found myself like sort of really enjoying collaborating with people I've never met. And that sort of instilled a lot of ideas for like what I wanted to do, like when I grew up. And that's sort of what like inspired me to want to move from Sri Lanka. I wanted to like, for one, get to places where like the stuff I wanted to practice was more practical. Yeah, on the most part, it was like mostly to figure out a way to get into the stuff I wanted to get into creatively. That sort of inspired the move, if anything. But the practicalities of how it worked out was like quite different in terms of like I wanted to go to university, I wanted to get an education, but through that I wanted to find myself in a place where I can like do the stuff I really want to do. So sometime 2015, I decided to move to Canada for university, and I studied. Started off in biomed because that's what I was like studying towards in high school. And in Sri Lanka, there's like a big thing of like people generally pick either they're going into like a business-oriented career or like a math-oriented career or like a bio-oriented career. And like your last couple of years of exams and stuff are all sort of oriented around that. So you usually end up having like grade 10, you kind of pick which path you're going, and your final set of exams are like very business oriented, math oriented, or like bio oriented. And I always found myself sort of leaning into the bio side of things. I loved biology growing up, and I wanted to pursue that for higher studies, essentially. And through that, like, I found my interest in genetics, which overlapped nicely with like my comp sci interest. So like I at sort of every chance I got to make a choice or decision around it, I tried to align it in a way that like I knew I would be interested in it, instead of sort of, because there's some like mentality of like what, like, you know, growing up, my parents always told me like, become a doctor, become a doctor. That's sort of, you know, my parents are engineers, and they would still want me to be like a doctor, you know, and that's like a thing that just like is like a default. So you have to work your way away from it, if anything. So I did a lot of work to sort of figure out exactly what I wanted to do.
How did you work away from that though? Because I feel like that's like a specter that like haunts your psychology.
It is at some level. You have to come to terms with it. And I also feel like as you go along, you find confidence in yourself about like certain things that you can do and certain things that like come naturally to you. And I don't know, sometimes it feels naive to sort of pick that way, like, but I don't know, looking back, I feel like it has generally worked out. At least I'm like happy with the direction I've been coming in. And I can't say so much about, like, I wouldn't know for certain about any other option, you know? Yeah. I sort of tried to pick what like came as naturally to myself as possible. And yeah, so university, I mostly studied a mix of like genetics and comp sci. They had like a bioinformatics program. I think like it's through that combination of comp sci that I met you, because we were in like some of those comp sci classes together. And so like that university sort of was also when I like started practicing more of like the projects that I wanted to do, since I was like in high school back home in Sri Lanka. I felt like I had access to a lot more resources here. And it allowed me to just like, in my summers off, or like even honestly during the university years, I would like work towards, I know we would call these like companies, but they were just like projects, and that like sometimes turned into companies because they needed funding.
I think yours were always companies.
uh,
You always had a big vision for like what.
yeah, I always had like something that I was working towards, if anything, or at least try to frame the stuff that I was interested in and like something I wanted to do in that setting, because it really motivated me at that point in time. I would say it still motivates me. And I found myself pursuing things consistently. Like after my classes, I'd be working on something. During the summers, I would find a way to like find a grant or like find a program that would let me just like stay here over like the summer and work on something. And that's sort of how a lot of like, that's how like Tidl started, Alchemy started that way.
But we also spent a lot of time in like Propel, right? And that was, I keep having this like recurring thought to myself about how hanging out in that place was really interesting, because I met so many interesting people who ended up building their own stuff, and, like, as I guess an entrepreneurial center. And it really was nothing other than just like a room with a bunch of tables, if you think about it, right?
That place was, it was incredible in its own way, in that like it attracted people there that you kind of like, I really enjoyed hanging around them. And I feel like I gained a lot from hanging around these sorts of people. Like everybody was like, they wanted to pursue something, they were working towards something. You'd see them in the weekends, you'd see them when they don't have classes, you'd see them in like the mornings.
It was a community.
Yeah, it truly was a community. Yeah, it kind of formed itself too. I feel like there were a couple people there that like really put effort into like the programming. But even more than that, it was just like open door. You know, if you're a person working on something, come hang out. We'll find a way to help you. We'll find a way to help you find some funding for it. It helped people realize stuff.
Having that physical assembly though is like so critical, because it was that place where you could just like go. And I do think it's very isolating if you are in that perspective in university, where you're like, I want to build something, I have ideas, I want to make software, I want to make a project, or I want to do something in business. And then you're like, who do I hang out with, right? Or like, where do I go? But having that central entrepreneurship center was like a place where you would meet other people who were like, oh, like, I'm building apps, or I'm doing this kind of thing. But let's start with Tidl then, because I think that's the first project / company you were building at the time.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, the problem was that you were frustrated because people had credentials that they couldn't articulate on like LinkedIn platform or something like that.
Yeah. um, what it really started off as was I found myself, like, I was in this biomed program and I was looking for like internships, things I could do. And I felt like the work I wanted to immediately do, I didn't have like credentials against, but I had a ton of work I've done, like projects and stuff. And I found it, for one, I was solving the problem of like, how do I present my work in a way that somebody would want to hire me, give me a job over somebody that like might be studying this full time, or like might already have like some experience around it. And I felt like that was not being fulfilled by the tools that existed at the time. You'd have LinkedIn that like is basically a resume. You'd have other platforms that sort of let you like rejig your resume, and then you have a whole class of tools that let you do portfolios, which is exactly what that's for. But I felt like there wasn't like a discovery platform based entirely around like I can put up like screenshots of the projects I've worked on and tell a story around like the evolution of those projects, and then have that as like a stand-in basis for like why somebody would hire me
with a social network
with a social network angle. Like you could argue similarly to like LinkedIn, if anything, like that degree of community, in the sense that everybody has a profile and you could gather some social proof from people you've engaged with, people you worked with, and like could that stand as like the basis for somebody hiring you. I look back at that idea and I feel like it's more fitting today almost in the way things are going, than it was even at the time, because at the time it just felt like it felt like there was something missing there. Like there was an unwillingness to, like, there was obviously tons of people that would go off of like recommendations, obviously, or like even portfolios for hiring, especially when they're hiring like interns or like younger folks. But I didn't feel like there was like a general acceptance of it. Yeah.
Well, I still think that like there is a kind of void. What I would say is, it's specifically in software. I think that there's this ability to kind of like build your own credential, right? And I think it's because the accessibility cost was lowered so dramatically, and that like somebody with a laptop could build a portfolio of all these different things.
Yeah.
But the analog to that doesn't exist in like biology, for example. Like I studied medical science too, and like I was really interested in synthetic biology, but like I didn't have 40K to drill into a synthetic bio lab, and like doing it in my apartment probably wasn't a good idea. But now it's like we do have a little bit more of that. I think we were going through a period of transition where it was like you needed like a hardcore credential, but now people are seeing, okay, well, maybe a credential doesn't necessarily indicate or is not indicative of like quality or skill. Like even, I think you met Danielle from 1517, right?
Yeah.
Danielle and Michael is a venture fund that they fund, high school students with these like ambitious ideas. And at the time that was like seen as kind of very heretical. Now it's, I guess, maybe a bit more accepted, but a lot of that happens within the software world, right?
Yeah,
but
that's true.
You can still do some of these things, and you're right, like now it's a bit more accepted because like maybe you can be a biohacker and you have a blog or this kinds of things. So you were building this thing and you were like facing some sort of friction in the process.
Yeah, I for one just wanted to have something for myself that I could use, for one, and like I've always tried to align the things that I work on with like a challenge that I have, or like a problem that I want to solve for myself, because I always figured that would be like the stuff that I would have the most opinions about, and that has generally like served me pretty well. So like anytime I'm working on something, it generally has to do with what I am going through at that moment in time. And if I remember right, I ended up working on it over like building it properly over a summer, and then the next summer I found like a grant to work on it for a summer as well, and that's when I like just like tried to work, like I wanted to work on the other side of that problem, as in like I figured out the part around somebody can create a timeline of their work have a profile of sorts, but then what would the people looking at it from the other side see and experience? And I worked on some fuzzy ideas around, like IBM was doing some programs with Propel, and they were like offering their like machine learning services, and they were doing these interesting things with. They were helping out with hiring for like one of the basketball leagues, I think, and they were doing these personality matching things when they were going through like the team makeup process to figure out like what the best composition was in terms of like the personalities of people. I don't know how strongly that research stands. I don't think it like stands that strongly right now, but I felt like at that point in time, this was just like coming up as things that people were trying out. There was not a lot of like proof to anything, but they were like experimenting with this stuff. And I wanted to try a similar concept around like, hey, let's say you have a bunch of people and like they talk about their work, they talk about their writing, or like you pull in their writing, and you can what they essentially was doing was taking a bunch of writing and then coming up with like a personality assessment around it, or like creating a personality assessment around people's written content. I wanted to extend that to like, okay, if you have like a team of people working on a bunch of things and you have like designers and engineers, and what if you could do like personality assessment type things, not just around like personality trait related things, but maybe also around the work they've done, and you can come up with these like fuzzy matches of people, like this person has a ton of experience, but this person doesn't, but they're like, they think the same way, or they are like interested in the same things. Like something to point at like potential without having like the credential. It was very fuzzy, but that was what I was trying to like work on. And I had these like fancy UIs around like you put up a bunch of like text, like written stuff. You put up your portfolio, and it'll do this like personality assessment that they were like they were like already promoting, if anything. And I wanted to see like, does this stand for anything? And that's sort of where I left it off before I pivoted towards more
Darwin.
Yeah, Darwin and like alchemy. And like the reasoning behind it all was literally that I felt like you can't run like very programmatic assessments around, like, you know, ideally if you have a credential, you can do these kinds of assessments, or like some sort of credentials, some sort of history. You could do some like programmatic assessment. But like what really would work is like social proof. And if you can somehow like track that social proof to like, you know, a lot of the cases I'm talking about are people that have like self-taught to themselves something. So how do you back the self-taughtness? And that's sort of why I went into alchemy, where it was like, okay, you'd have these like programs of sorts that people could do, and then like the credential gets built into like this platform, or like there'd be communities of people teaching each other things, and then based on those conversations, or based on like how helpful you are, or like what things that you are addressing, like can that stand for experience on a certain subject or topic.
You kind of try to like, it's kind of like trying to condense what is the clout associated with somebody's follower count on Twitter, but into something more parsable. Like you could look up you, for example, or like other influencers or whatever, and you could be like, okay, but why? Like why are they here? And what you're trying to do is kind of create like, I guess, like a resume of sorts, or a CV of sorts, to explain that.
It's funny how like Twitter kind of like short form social media platforms kind of do this in a sense that like people that have been posting about a specific topic over like the last year, you kind of can go through that timeline pretty quickly, and like based on, I don't know, you could do the comments or the likes or just the engagement around it, people come up with these like fuzzy measurements, and people actually go off and hire people on that like basis today, which is really cool to see. So all it really maybe takes is just like, you know, what's people's histories, like can you history and like the social engagement around it.
But then you started working on Darwin, right? Because you were like, okay, well, there's all these, I think at the time Medium was like, that was the main medium form, long form content platform. So you were like, well, there's all these articles on Medium. Let's put them together into like these kind of consolidated, I guess, what now? Do you know those like GitHub repos where you have
like repositories of links out to things? Is exactly that.
It's basically that, right? And then you were trying to build like a roadmap. I'm thinking of
Mhm.
like a developer, like a front end developer, like back end developer roadmap, but
Mhm.
using the content that was already present on the internet instead of
Yeah.
being like, go learn this. You're like, but here's the article.
Exactly, and like have it to be as like community built as possible. So you could have like, you start off with like this introductory video and it splits off into two paths based on like what different people have suggested.
Yeah.
And you could have these like community built courses that like become standardized over time, if anything, by the mere fact of like this is the path that people follow to learn this thing.
How frustrating is it that sometimes you can see what the future like looks like, but
Yeah.
the timing is wrong,
Right.
right?
I think like it's so interesting to look back at these things and be
Yeah.
like, that like kind of makes sense, but like my God, the timing was horrible.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
And like nobody wanted to believe in stuff like that.
Yeah.
And like I'm honestly really happy that the world sort of ended up where it is today in terms of at least like the stuff we practice, and like the software landscape and the technology landscape like fully accepts that stuff now. And I feel like at some point, like especially with AI in the mix today, a lot of those old ideas can have like new feet to them.
I mean, there
Yeah.
is some concern though around like what, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting because especially with, I feel like we're in a kind of AI frenzy at the moment. Not, I have opinions, but you know, on one hand, what it does is it kind of levels like the playing field. So like, for example, like there's a lot of companies coming out of India, for example, lately, right? Like there's a ton of entrepreneurs and founders coming out of India, and I guess like even some parts of Asia as well. But at the same time, it's like it sort of it challenges a lot of like the existing like framings, I guess, around like the U.S., for example, being like a core hub of innovation. And I have this like book, The Sovereign Individual, which like has like one of these meta frames that I'm like constantly A/B testing against reality. And I'm like, is this actually, is this the direction we're going? So I do feel like right now it's a little bit, the best framework I've heard for the AI situation is that like where it's like the .com, it's like there's something interesting that's happened here, but like there's like a forward leading indicator of like 15 years into it. And like maybe that gets compressed. I don't know. I think the main challenge I have with AI stuff is it's like it's deeply uncharismatic. Like to use the Peter Thiel framing, like it's deeply uncharismatic. Like there's no future where we're like, okay, and like humans live happily ever after or something like that, right? So there's I think that's one side of the challenge. And then I think also it's I mean there's other questions about like what does it mean from an individual perspective. Like maybe it shows us that we're less special than we think we are, right? I know when I try to clod my problems, right, and I'm like, you know, this and this is happening, it's like, oh, this is totally normal, and you're like, oh, is it really normal? But I guess as somebody who is like an autodidact, I think that's the right word, where you're like you're self-taught, it is kind of like an isolating journey, right? It is an independent journey where you are trying to like fit your way into a box, but the box isn't built for you, right? And you eventually sold Alchemy because I think you wanted to work on some other projects, and then you started going through Y Combinator at that time.
Actually, what we did was not sell like Alchemy, but there were a bunch of folks that found like use for that software because it was basically more like community generated notes, and the foundation of that application was that. And like they wanted to use it for like high school math programs and stuff where like the software would be helpful. So we like gave them the software essentially. And that this was towards the end of university. So I was like truly the projects that I followed during university were like out of pure interest. I just wanted to do something and have something that like I worked on. And I've always had stuff like that. And it's just been an interest, and like it was necessarily like I specifically did not care about making money out of those projects, and like I didn't find myself optimizing for that.
Yeah, you didn't have it. Well, I don't know. On one hand, I would say that you were focused. Like I do think you always wanted to be the CEO and like run the thing. But yeah, maybe the infancy for the business model, right? Because I think that was sometimes the things I would ask you. I was like,
Yeah.
but like, what's the rev model?
Yeah.
Like, how does this
Yeah.
like functionally?
Yeah.
What's the product? Like, what are people buying?
Mm-hmm.
Which is hard. Like
Mhm.
sometimes that's even myself when I'm trying to like think of stuff where I'm like, what is the actual problem?
Mhm.
And this has been a big frame for me. It's taken me years and years and years because I used to ask myself, I was like, do businesses create things or solve problems? Like, or right? Do they do one or do the other?
Mhm.
I used to fight myself internally because I was like, I don't know. Because if you look
Yeah.
at Facebook, you're like, does that solve the problem? I don't know, right?
Mhm.
More and more recent years, I think all businesses do functionally solve problems, right? Even if it's down to like Facebook, which the problem is like entertainment, connection, that kind of stuff. And so that framing has been helpful, but it was an aggravating process.
Yeah,
because
it's hard to start there. Like
it's
hard
not
to kindle.
inspiring.
Exactly, it's not inspiring. Yeah, and like I found myself like not caring as much about it. But then towards the end, I was like, okay, now I had to get practical. And I always had these like phases or like years in my life where I felt myself being extremely practical about things, versus like being more loose and explorative about things. And I felt like towards the end of university, like I found myself like very much wanting to be more practical about things.
Because you went to Shopify, right?
Yeah, I was basically in my last year, I had a bit of time off to work on. Was this towards? Yeah, this was towards the end of my last year. Essentially, before I ended my last year, I wanted to figure out something that I was going to work on for like the next couple of years, if anything. Like my ideal was that I can go work for myself right out of university, and we found a little bit of funding for Clew, and like Clew sort of came about in my last year. I did an internship with Shopify, and got to work with like a lot of teams, and like felt like that was a point in time where I was looking for ideas in like anywhere I like worked at, like talked about. I was actively searching for problems essentially, and a practical problem to solve. And this sort of problem of like teams collaborating, having a lot of content online that is like disconnected from like the conversations they were having or the threads that were going on in like various apps, like connecting the dots between those things came up as like a very high level but like practical thing to try and solve. And that felt like sort of turning point, especially in like that last year, in terms of like finding like, okay, I feel like I have some opinions about how to go about solving that. Like I have worked with a bunch of teams. I've been like collaborating with people, like especially like creative people, since a like pretty young age, and I had like a good bit of opinions around what could this process be, how could this process be improved, like how could it be streamlined, like what things could help ease the pain of like 10 people collaborating from different ends of the globe, and they like, one person's work depends on somebody else. Like how do you pass that work around?
Where's the Jira ticket?
Yeah, where's the Jira ticket? And so started digging into that problem. And so like right out of university, we found a little bit of funding for about like 6 to 8 months. And that's when I like built like the MVP. Like it didn't go that far. It didn't like, it started off as just like universal search. Like you connect up all of your apps, you get one search bar. And we wanted to like put the stuff from that search like folders, but content from all of your different apps.
Yeah, it was like Google Drive, Figma, it was like
yeah.
Spotlight, but you bring all those things.
Exactly. And like I was spending a lot of time in Toronto, so I would like literally go from, find people I knew at Shopify would introduce me to people that like work down the street at like different companies, and I just like walk from place to place, just like talking to people about those ideas, and like found more and more that like people want to use this thing, want to try and use this thing, which like kind of grew my confidence, and I okay, maybe this is something that like that has more legs. But I was also figuring out a lot of life things at that point in time. Like I really needed a job. I needed to start working, and at that point in time, sort of like like a soft contract I've had with my parents is like they helped put me through university, and I helped put my sister through university. So like I was starting the phase of like starting to put my sister through university as well. So I really needed to figure out like a more stable source of income, like work on something consistent. So went back to my team at Shopify and worked there for a little bit. I was working nights on Clew, and I think like a few months in, I think close to a year in, I got into YC, which was when we were basically like had an MVP, had people that wanted to pay to use the thing, and it was a matter of like go or no go, like do you do this thing for real or do you not? And like
this wasn't the first time you applied to YC either, right?
no,
Like,
I've applied a bunch of times. Yeah, I found myself like, especially while in university, like whatever I was working on, I would apply to these things and I would like talk to people if anything. And I think it helped, if anything, like to get to a point where like at least I figured out like something that I wanted to work on, and like I wanted to take all the way, for the lack of a better word. Like I wanted to try and see it through, and also sort of having a path emerge that sort of allows me to do that. So yeah, got into YC, I think summer 2019, I want to say. Might be 2020. And went and did that. Most of that program was just like figuring out like the packaging for the product, like how much are we going to charge, how might this scale, how might we get ourselves like enough runway to like continue working on the thing, because it was definitely an MVP, and like especially with like enterprise oriented products like that, like you have a lot of bars to hit, if anything. So I ended up raising a little bit of money, worked on that for about 2 years, and like it went through a bunch of transformations, because when I look back on it, I feel like I pushed through it too quickly, if anything. Like we had this like universal search product that people wanted to use. We had like a decent sort of like people that used it. We had some people that were like very sticky with using it. There was some promise that this is actually helping people. But I tend to be like a very vision oriented people. I think about like, okay, what are the outcomes of using these kinds of tools? How do I tend to work back from like, what is my ideal process around something, and like how do you like sort of position tools or set up tools in a way that enables that like ideal experience with as little of like tool-based opinions as possible. Like for example, Jira, if you take it, has so many opinions built into how it's used. Like it sort of conforms anybody that uses it into this like everybody knows what it means to have to use Jira.
It's like you're in the closet. And
Yeah,
you're like,
and I like as much as possible, I wanted to try and escape those kinds of opinions that tools tend to instill on like how collaboration should happen. They should just be like these soft things that sort of conform to however a group of people want to work. And I kind of wanted, those were the ideas I was trying to pursue. And that's sort of where like, it's this like constant fight between like the practical path that like, like consistently grows something, with like the not so practical visionary part that like wants to create something that like stands for some values that you hold. Yeah, some ideals that you hold,
But can we pause there for a second? Because in design, I find that some of the best products are actually deeply opinionated in terms of how they approach
that is fair, yeah.
Right? Like Apple, for example, the first time I chose an Apple product, I was like frustrated because as a developer, I was like, I can't find the home.
Yeah.
And I was used to Windows computers. Like, where is my local disk C?
Yeah.
How do I find my... And yet, like, they're very opinionated, and they create a great product, right? So how do you, I guess, as like that design mind, approach that? Because I do feel like a lot of great design products they do force me to do something in a way, and like sometimes I don't like the way, and maybe I need a different tool. But how do you think about that?
I think opinions definitely matter in that sense, like especially when it comes to, like, opinions are hard. And if somebody doesn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about a problem or like experiencing a problem or experiencing what they're trying to solve, they may not even have the opinions to begin with to like go about designing something. So I truly believe in like opinions in that sense. What I also mean is that I feel like in certain industries, especially like, software management, the opinions lean the wrong way, if anything. Or like for example, if you take Jira, I do feel like in terms of like an engineering practice, like a workflow, that can be like a truly useful structure to have. But from like a creative perspective, like how do I want to break down thinking about, like if you're in an early stage startup and you're thinking about like how to form this product, like and like you're a group of people trying to like break down a problem into a bunch of pieces, I can both see like how it is valuable, but I also see like how it gets in the way of how I might go think about like breaking down a problem, or how I might want to structure some work. I would say like on the most part, I would lean into my opinions when I come to building things. And that comes with like some people might like them, some people might not like them, and you kind of have to deal with that. But I also do feel that like a good part of design is thinking about how other people might use the thing, and like really focusing on like how might people go about using this thing, what sort of behavior does this bring out of them. And I feel like it's possible to look at experiences and be like, is this conforming people towards like a good ideal, or like is it conforming people towards a bad ideal? And obviously all of these things are opinions, so like I never sort of tend to think of the products I design or like stuff I design as like a one-off solution to everybody's problem. And it's definitely not the case. I meet plenty of people who either like really don't like how I go about doing certain things, or like really love the opinions that go into them.
Yeah. I find a lot of design is magic, to be honest. Like from my perspective, sometimes I remember the first human-computer interaction course I took, and I was like, this is just like a different magical way of thinking.
Yeah.
Like it's a very intriguing, like very holistic perspective on things. And sometimes I find it's that intuitive next step. Like you just, people have a certain talent towards that intuitive next step, right? They just know that like there's an empty state position that has to be here or something like that. And that's why I say it's a bit magic, because it's kind of like wizardry in my opinion. But you built almost 3 iterations of Clew, right? You had your V1, which was like your spotlight bar. Then I think you had a slightly more versed out product, and then you started building this like kind of not workflows, but like arbitrary views that you could look into. And then you came to this scenario where you're like, do I keep going, or do I, stop and do so? What happened at that point? Take us through that.
It sort of evolved from like a very simple product to something that tried to pursue like a very flexible tool around, like it has the primitives of all of the data, all of the content, and you can basically arrange it however you like for your work. And turns out that is like too much flexibility. That's if anything,
you thought
that's,
Notion was flexible.
The cool thing though is that like in the years since, I look at those ideas and I'm like, okay, the complicated parts about that, you can solve that now. Like the state of AI today is perfect for solving that problem. But at that point in time, when a human needs to have an opinion about how they want to organize their tool, the layout of their tool, that's turns out to be quite messy in terms of like it really comes down to most people don't have those opinions or don't have to want to think about that stuff. They want their tool to
do it.
solve. Yeah, exactly. They want the tool to have some kind of opinions.
Do it for me.
Yeah, exactly. And there were like, this isn't to say that there were a group of people that really appreciated the flexibility, and anytime we took something away, they like screamed about it. But like if you were thinking from like a purely like business sense, and like you're going to go solve problems for businesses, for people that were business oriented, that were trying to solve like real problems, they were okay with making the trade-off in terms of like the flexibility. Like structured tool that does a bunch of things. And I think that like really, if there was like a specific reason where that idea sort of didn't work, it would have been that at that point in time. But I feel like there's like a ripe opportunity today where like people almost yearn for that flexibility with all of these like AI tools in the mix, because it's even like a small thinking mind can sort through a lot of complexity in a tool like that, if anything. Like for example, like if you have like an open canvas with like your last month's design iterations, and wanted to find something like semantically, you could like do it very easily today, and especially like to a degree that you weren't able to do it like 10 years ago, if anything. If you wanted to like go through a bunch of threads, like a whole set of conversations that happened in Slack, and you have all of this stuff dumped into like one view, and you wanted to find like the common threads and ideas, like that wasn't possible 4 or 5 years ago.
It's, I think one of the changes specifically even from like a design thing, like I've been hammering this like opinion for a little while, which is that like it was something I heard, I think, in a conversation between Naval and some other podcaster, and he said LLMs enable us to basically bring it's a natural language interface. And that just like blew my mind, because I was like, oh my gosh, just think about the development of like how computers and like interaction design, right? We had the command line, we typed in some commands, then we had the GUI, and then that was like, you had this interface, which was the computer and the mouse, and then this was the way that you articulated your intent to the system, and you said, okay, I want to open this app now, I want to do this. And now it's a higher bandwidth interface, right? Where you can, sometimes I just like tell ChatGPT, or I just like talk to it, right, in kind of like a human way. So it really changes the whole interaction design, right? And I think it lends a lot of really interesting questions as to like interface design and how all these things change. Like when you don't have to have like a UI to basically click a button to go to your bank statements, like how does that change design? Even as you were talking about the canvas, right? Like imagine you had a Figma, and then you could just like semantically type like where was, that design that I did with like the airplane and that kind of thing. And so it's a very different, world, like a design space, which is challenging. But at the same time, I think what you mentioned with the tools being opinionated, like I go back to jobs to be done theory, right? Like, and that's a big framework that I come at the world with nowadays, which is like, what is the actual job that you're hiring this product to do? And I think a lot of times, one of the challenges today, especially, is like we have such floodlight focus, right? Like it's so difficult because of all the opportunity with like social media, Twitter, audience building, all these things, to kind of like really get super focused. And myself, as of recently, I've been starting to really appreciate more minimal tools, right? Like I went back to using Bear, like the note-taking app, because I was tired of like feeling, I was using Obsidian for a while, and I loved the idea of like connecting all my notes for some purpose in the future. But it was sort of like this exercise in just like busy work, and I never really did anything. And then I got anxiety because every time I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, like I have all these ideas and like I could create more stuff. And I was like, I already have so much stuff to do, right? So and then for me, I always find myself then going back to even more primitive things where I'm like, oh, I just pull up my pencil and a piece of paper. And I feel like it gives me an opportunity to really connect in that like flow kind of thing. So I think that infinite flexibility is, and I find especially AI stuff is very overwhelming today. Like there's too many tools, and I don't need more tools. I think it's like, it's also just figuring out how to use the tools. But we sort of diverged a bit because you were in this place, you had the third iteration of Clew, it was too much flexibility, you had this balance between the pragmatic and the ideal, and then what happened? You decided to sell it.
I feel like at that point in time, it came down to a matter of we needed a bunch more funding if we wanted to try and achieve the next stage, because we were treading on like full-on workspaces. And that was something that was being done by like way more funded companies, well-funded companies, and at like a much higher level, if anything. And to sort of get into that, we needed a lot more funding. And those ideas were definitely like at that point in time trying to be ahead of that time, ahead of its time, and especially like without AI in the context, it felt ahead of its time, and um, it made sense to sell it to like a company that might be able to take some of those ideas forward. And it came down to sort of figuring out something where we could work on the ideas, continue to work on those ideas, because at that point in time, I truly believed like I wanted to be able to, like, part of why I was building Clew was because I wanted to use Clew to run Clew. You know, like I want that to be the thing that like I organized myself around, and that like a lot of the ideas that went into it like was that was the root of it. And I'm like a big proponent of like building tools to solve my own problems, and like and at some level I wanted it to exist more than even just like if it even doesn't mean like it's my company I'm doing. And that sort of naturally went towards like an acquisition, and worked on those ideas for a couple more years, and now I'm back to pursuing my own ideas, if anything.
How did you deal with that process internally? Because I feel like investing probably, it would have been 3 years, probably at least a year in development, and then 2 years actually full time with the funding and stuff, and then you're having to make this decision. Like, I for one would be like, the confidence side, I'd be like, I suck because I couldn't do something, or am I going to make the right decision? Like, there's always this, I feel like, especially with entrepreneurship, there's this idea of like, is this one of those moments where I need to persevere or not? And I feel like we're in this challenging cultural dichotomy too, where I'm personally challenged by it, because on one hand, there's like, I suppose what you could encapsulate as like the hustle culture, where it's like, you need to be working harder, you need to be working more hours, all these things, like this is the path to success. And then I feel like there's another sort of emerging culture where it's like, maybe you can allow flow more easily, right? And maybe they end up in different destinations. Like maybe we can start at different ports and end up in different destinations. But I feel like if we were to talk about the first cultural like proponent, like that mentality says like it's all about just persevering, moving through. But like, how did you deal with that internally?
I like looking back at it, I think one thing I take away is like the perseverance part is super important. Like if I had to pick, I would pick the perseverance, generally speaking. But I also feel like life sometimes doesn't work out that way. Sometimes there are things that take you out of it, things that like can, for lack of better words, like practicalities, if anything, of just like life and like what your needs are at that point in time. Sometimes those can get in the way. But the one thing I would take away is like perseverance. Like obviously it was like a hard decision. I spent a whole bunch of time working on these things, and like especially when you work on something like over a long period of time and you put a whole bunch of your opinions into it and like your beliefs into it,
energy, everything.
It like you get tied to it in a strange way, and that takes a while to work yourself out of it. Like it essentially comes down to you have to prove to yourself again in some way that you are capable, if anything. Capable, or like you could use a whole number of words for it, I think, but like whatever works for you in terms of like what you're looking for after an experience like that. It might be that you're like capable of it, or like capable of creating things, if anything. So I found myself dealing with it in a whole bunch of ways. One of it was that like I did feel like I got the opportunity to put more time into Clew for one thing, and kind of see it through and get it out of my system, if anything. And the other aspect of it was like I spent a whole bunch of time like thinking about it, like what was the experience here, like what did I learn here, and something that helped was that when I did start working on it, I kind of had the idea that like what I was trying to do, I was inexperienced to do. Like I knew that going in, and I knew that I needed to learn a bunch of things. And when I was like starting Clew, I had this idea, I had a path in my mind of how a business should be built, and like how you go about that process. because I watched my dad start a business from like nothing and like a very sustainable thing. And my sort of opinions around building businesses, or like all of any tinge of experience that I had, was like this like sustainable variety of it.
Okay.
Where you like stay small, you kind of like fulfill your needs, and you kind of grow from there. And those were the opinions I was carrying with myself. And so when we took like funding from Y Combinator and kind of put ourselves in like the venture backed path, that was very different to me. It's and like I wouldn't say like I was 100% prepared for that. And if anything, I find that experience super valuable now, just because like I know what I would do differently in that situation. I kind of almost see like what it's more appropriate for. So I took a ton of things away from it, if anything. And like when I was starting out, I had the idea that like, okay, like I don't know exactly what I'm getting into, but I know that like I'm capable of moving quickly and building stuff quickly and like going through an experience quickly. And I kind of knew that like there weren't guarantees of success. This is either going to like work out really well, or it's going to work out somewhat okay. I kind of knew that like going in, that like the effort put into making something, anything, I knew how to make that useful in the tail end, either in terms of the experience that I gain, or the value I would be like creating through it for somebody else. I knew that it would like fall into one of those categories. And even like before I moved to this side of the world, I had an idea of like, I want to work on my own things. I would like to have my own company. But I also had the idea that like you're going to have to fail a lot to get there, because like you don't know everything. And you also like, I didn't find myself like like if anything, I didn't find myself as educated as I wanted to be going into these things. And I knew that I would have to like learn a lot of things along the way. Yeah, so like that combination of things kind of made it easier to rationalize, if anything, like, and like figure out the experience beyond that. But yeah, it did take a bunch of work.
Yeah, I feel like you can't be, this is something I'm learning too, is that like, and I've read so many business books, like I'm a chronic in place of action, read something about it or find something to educate myself, because you want to be prepared, right? Like you're like, I want to prepare myself for anything that could come my way. But the reality is sometimes you just won't get to that level where you can exercise that knowledge, or in any way, shape, or form it'll be useful to you, unless you're actually in that moment. And it's in that way, it's a practice. What you said, for example, with like the kind of investing your identity into it in some level, I think one of the hardest things is that the problem is, as a person who chronically starts things, is that the starting side of things is very fun and it's enjoyable, but actually there's not much material reward from that side. Like you need to have an app like out for like 6 months, let's say, before you actually have that foundation as like even like a technical code base or engineering side, where you can actually start adding things that are interesting, right? And that's something that I'm learning too, where you're like, okay, so you have to spend this like, a little bit of time building this foundation, so to speak. And like after that is like when you actually start adding, that's where like the value can actually come from. But it's difficult because the starting side of things is very fun and interesting. And but at the same time, I do think you have to have that alignment, right? Where you're like, am I actually, because I started a bunch of projects that were deeply unpractical, right? And I just thought they would be really cool and interesting. But maybe I tried to do it because I thought it would be cool to see, or like, innovative or whatever, versus like, was I really invested into this idea? And I think that process for me has been a process of just like realizing how much time I wasted, but not really wasted, because you see like, okay, I know that I could build this, and maybe I could spend like a month or 2 months or something on building this, but like in the end I might just shelve it or throw it away or something like that. So do I really want to open up that box? But then you sold your company to Dropbox, and then you were working at Dropbox for a little bit. You still kind of had a little bit of that urge, and then I think it was like last year you left, and then you started UNMS
Mhm.
Technologies.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that? Because you also had another app. You have two apps out right now.
Mhm.
One is Pile,
Mhm.
which is like an AI journal kind of experience.
Mhm.
And then you have a new product that you're building called Research, which is this AI collaborative research-oriented product with features that allow the curation and understanding of research in a more accessible way.
Mhm. Yep. So yeah, it's sometime through my Dropbox experience, I always found myself like, for one, I wanted to just build things. I just enjoy making stuff, and I found myself just like working on anything that I like found interesting, and like I didn't have any rules for it. Again, I just went full flexibility in terms of just like ideas.
You built something to monitor your plant.
Yeah,
If it was
just,
dying or
yeah.
not.
Just random things. I considered it as a bit of a, like, part of it was like a learning experience, part of it was like a searching for new ideas, and like seeing what sort of felt right to me. And it was just very open-ended, if anything. And I knew that like I wanted to work on my own things. Like I feel like I learned that lesson a couple of times over now, that like I kind of believe it deep down.
You have to keep getting exposed to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And seeing all of like the progress in AI, like for like I at the current moment, I think that AI has created a lot of value for individuals, even like more than they do in like a commercial sense or like an economic sense. I think it's through the individual, if anything. Like at least I find so much value out of what I can do with AI, what I can understand with AI. So I wanted to mess with these tools as much as possible, like figure out how they can be useful to me. Like Pile was an exploration in just like I journaled for like a long time, and it's just always hard to go back on journals and reflect on them. Like it's something that happens like too rarely, if anything. I don't find myself being like an extremely like reflective person, but I appreciate its value in like you truly could go through like similar experiences twice, and it helps to remember how you felt way back when you went through a certain experience or whatever, just to feel it. And like connecting those dots, I wanted to create a tool that could do that. So like a little, you could almost think of it as like a private Twitter. You post your thoughts into it whenever you feel like it, and like sometimes you can hit a reflect button on a thought today, and it'll pull up like similar thoughts from like the past.
Retweet your past
Exactly.
thoughts.
Pull from your past. So a very minimal thing. I just like built it for myself, and when I tend to build things for myself, I really don't like, I just let my opinions like really seep into the thing. And people, like some people really loved how it's designed and how it works and stuff. And so I put it out there. Like I actually wasn't even planning on publishing it. I just like open sourced. I've worked on like 3 iterations of the thing over like many years. I've had like a command line tool that does it. So I just finally put the GUI out, and like that was like the first action. This was like just right on the curve of being able to actually use AI to help with programming and to like to utilize it for building something. And it kind of gave me a lot of confidence around how like you can actually accelerate how quickly you can build something, how deeply you can go into like building certain ideas. And that's sort of where like UNMS started for me. Like I spent a whole bunch of time just building things for myself. Like I've always wanted, like this like personal dashboard of sorts that like has all of my stuff in it in exactly the way I want. It connects to all of the random stuff that like I spent some time building like a home server. I wanted like stuff from that to feed into this software, and I just like open-ended, like wasteful building, I would call it. And that I called that app UNMS just because of I at one point got that domain. I honestly can't even remember the project I got it for, but it was a very short un.ms. I just felt like it flowed nicely, like it felt nice to type it. And like over a whole that period of time, I was like, maybe that's what I would use, and like I wanted to figure out like how do I infuse some meaning into that, and I called it like Udara's New Media Studio. I don't tell people that, but like
Yeah.
that was like part of like the thinking behind it.
Yeah. That's kind of nice.
Yeah. And it was just like this one app that just had like a sidebar of like many apps that like I can click through. Pile was one of them, and like it was just random things. And the most useful thing about it, and like I sort of encourage people to do this if anything, is like have one wrapper application, or like maybe it's not even a wrapper, but like one foundation that you can build a lot of things into, and like not in like a professional sense, but just for yourself. Like if I wanted to experiment with an idea, I already had like this UNMS thing, and all I had to do was like create a folder, but put a bunch of files into it, and it's already like in an application. It's already got like authentication or whatever. It can already talk to AIs. It can already have access to my files. Like all of these things like brought very close to the surface, so I can just plug and play them into like little apps that I wanted to build.
Building like your own infrastructure to build on.
Exactly. And like I feel like personally for me, where I come into this is that like I've been trying to figure out how to specifically build software for like a long time, because I got into building software by first sort of being more into designing things and like having opinions about like how things should be designed, and then I wanted to like have my own products. And it took a really long time to figure out, like, for one, programming, and then also like how does software come together, how do you deliver software, like what are the frameworks you could use, what are the systems that you could use. And so I had a ton of opinions at this point in time of like how applications should be structured, how services should be structured. And I put all of that into just like building one thing, and AI helped sort of, build a lot of the stuff on top of it. And like that honestly just inspired me to just work on a whole bunch of other stuff. Like what I've been working on with UNMS today is literally taking pieces from what I've been working on and playing around with, and like turning them into like products that other people could use too. And I really just lean into my opinions about things. If anything, it's like a trust exercise for me. It's just like
trusting your internal authority.
And like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I would much rather try to figure out how to trust it than to like try to figure out like what the right path is or whatever.
I don't know if you ever can. I feel like, I mean, it depends on what scale, right? Like I think there's this like idea, it's like, different scales are not the same thing, right? Like they're different. It's like 10 people versus 100 people is not 10 times. It's like a zebra versus an elephant, right? It's like they're different animals. So it's I think trusting that internal authority maybe comes at maybe smaller scales or stuff like that. And then when you're having to size up and make big things, like there is more of that pressure. You do have to figure out, okay, how does this actually serve X, Y, or Z?
Yeah.
But you did something interesting with Pile, which was like you open sourced it, and it kind of led me to this interesting thought where I was like, wow, there's this interesting world where you open source is kind of like an initial distribution model and audience building mechanism, right? Because now I see a lot of software. I mean, I don't know if it was like this before, but I see so much software now where people have an open source version and then they're like, cool, go self-host it, do whatever you want. And then if you don't want to do any of that, just pay us, right? So you did that with Pile, and it did kind of grow into quite a large project at the moment. And that kind of allowed you to start building your audience.
Yeah, I feel like it really helped get my product out there. I think that like open source really is a thing of its own. Like there are lots of people that engage in open source, whether it's like through just sharing their opinions, like helping to like back testing, to like literally making stuff for those projects. Like the logo for Pile was just made by somebody that like I met on Twitter. And they were just like kind enough, hey, like I'll tweak the details. Like I found like an interesting icon. I looked up like who made it, and I talked to them, and like, hey, it's for an open source project, and they were like very happy to work on it for me. And it's fulfilling in its own sense, just like the community aspect of it, but it is also a great vehicle for getting an idea out there, especially if you're starting out and you like, especially if it's something that's like quite opinionated, if anything. Yeah, I know that sounds like a little counterintuitive. I thought it was counterintuitive, like especially when you open source something, you expect it to have like wide use, and like in a lot of ways it makes sense to like open source like a foundational framework of something that lots of people can add to, and then like everybody can get value out of it. And like it was less intuitive to me to think of it as like fully formed end product software, open sourced. And like how would that play out? I feel like I've learned like good things about it. Like good things are like people actually help, people actually like products like that. They tend to trust it more because they have some sort of transparency there. But it also makes other things a little difficult in terms of like, okay, it is an actually like very opinionated product. When somebody wants to add something, like I do find like it's harder to work things out, if anything. Because not everything will fit into that product. Like I had some strong opinions about like how simple it should be. And like maybe like I feel like part of the reason that product works is it is like dead simple. It's just a timeline you just post into it. Like I didn't want it to become a complicated product. I didn't like like it's the one product that I use almost every single day on and off again. Like I use it at least 4 or 5 times a week for like the last year and a half solid. And it's literally just because it's just a thread you just post into it, and that's really all you do with it. And that's actually a different tangent almost, if like some ideas that I'm exploring on like very specific honed in software. But going back to sort of the open source side of things, I think it really did help build a large audience around that product, and like has helped me with all of the other products that I've been building as well.
Yeah, and now you're working on research, which is this, like as I mentioned, kind of like sort of like way better PDF reader, because we still go to like archive and then get the PDF, and then but at the same time, at least in my experience reading research papers deeply, is that you kind of have to do this like little chained exercise where you're like somebody makes a very, because one of the challenges with writing research papers is that they have to be very concise, right? So a lot of times there's just like a one line that's related to a previous paper that discusses some foundational idea, and unless you have that idea, you're like kind of lost. Like I think of a synthetic biology paper I read where they were talking about like crosstalk between certain genetic synthetic genetic material, and I was like, I don't know what that means. And then you kind of have to go read that other paper. Like it's like that backlink to the paper. You have to read that, and then it's like, okay, I have to go get that paper from there. And so you're kind of trying to build something that is like a little bit more friendly in that way.
Research really started out as like I found myself wanting to like learn more deeply about specifically like bioinformatics topics, especially with AI and LLMs. Like there was a lot of research coming out like literally every week, and it was almost like hard to keep up. It was actually quite hard. Like even if you read every day, it was quite hard. And I was like, I just want to cut the time. Like I don't want to read these things end to end. I want the core ideas. I want enough information to be like, I want it to be as practical as possible for me. Like I always, like even when I found it hard to read research papers just in like an open-ended sense, but I always find myself reading a lot when I like have a goal. Like I want to like explore like a product domain or something, and then I'm reading like it's so much more fun to read, if anything.
Well, it's engaged, right?
Yeah,
Like
it's engaged, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just make something that like cut the time of like having to do this process by as much as possible. And personally for me, like what really helps is the back and forth conversation. Like as I'm like reading a paper, like I want to be able to, for one, have the core ideas explained as simply as possible to me, because I like a lot, if anything, I might not remember what I want to remember to like be able to fully understand that paper. So I find myself having to sort of like if there was a teacher next to me or like a professor next to me, like I'd ask them about the fundamentals a lot, or like a specific topic that they're talking about. I'd want to like rehash it a lot.
You have to like load the
Yeah,
context
and
back
like
into your memory.
and like sometimes even it's just a matter of like I might not understand it the way it's explained right now, but somebody else might explain it from a different perspective that I might get it. And I have some idea, like a lot of problems, if I can frame it in like a programming context, sometimes like I tend to get it better. And I wanted to be able to do that with like the research papers I was reading. So like I just went about like, for one, it's just a basic PDF reader. You just load up PDFs, but you can also have like conversations with AI, like break the thing up into pieces, be able to like annotate stuff and like drill deeper into them. And also just like start building up a library of like all of the papers that I've explored and the notes I've written down about them, just to make it easier to go back on, if anything, but also to make it easier to build on what you are learning and to be able to sort of have a handle on, like, I learned about this topic, I like feel like I like actually understood it because I had it explained to me in like a perspective that I actually intuitively understand. Yeah, I think you just put it right, like in terms of like building up the right mental model for like the content of that paper. I wanted to figure out a way to do that as easily as possible. And I had a bunch of design opinions about that as well, like in terms of like, how do I design it in a way that makes it as engaging as possible for myself? It like it has to have all of the features it needs and nothing more. And like fundamentally, that app is just like extremely geared towards like make me enjoy the process of loading up a PDF and then like reading it and then put all of the pieces like I need to accelerate understanding the thing right as close to that experience as possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of people appreciate about that app as well.
Even the ability to like I'm drawn towards this book. I haven't read it, but it's called Metaphors We Live By, and it talks about how in some way the instrument of the metaphor is almost like foundational to how we understand anything, right? So think about computers, right? Like what is the metaphor for the desktop? Well, it's your desk that you would put papers on before you had the computer, right? And all these things, right? And so the ability to draw like metaphors and analogies to other domains, like connecting that kind of trans domain as a tool for mediation of learning, it's quite interesting. Like even if you, I don't know, you could imagine, I guess you could do this with systems today, like with memory, you could say like, I am a programmer. So like anytime you explain something, please explain it through the lens of a programmer, right? Or I'm a chef. So every time you explain something, please explain it through like the lens of a chef. But at the same time, you brought up this other thing, which is kind of like what you're doing with research is you're sort of trying to create like a lab team, right? In a way, right? Like you have kind of your lab members here and like you just ask them questions. Because I worked in a lab for 4 months. I didn't like doing the pipetting. I was not good at it. Reading the papers was really interesting. The models were so sexy and I was like, this is really cool. And then I did the pipetting and I was like, oh man, I suck at this. But I had like a lab team, right? And so I would ask my like lab manager how to do that, this, that, and the other thing. But when you replace that with then the AI, like what I worry about is that are we going to be replacing a lot of those human interactions that we have? And then does things become more lonely? Right? How do you think about that? I guess maybe there's a difference when you're like trying to solve a particular problem where you're like, okay, just get me the answer now. Like I'll replace that kind of thing. But I don't know. I think about this trend of like, it seems like we're getting more and more lonelier in some ways. And like, how do we have this like meaning making sense? Because working with people is interesting. Like when I worked in the Valley, like it was cool going into the office and you're like, like all this stuff, right? And then when we underwent this remote work transition, where everything went remote work, I found there was very different flavors, right? Like it felt very much more execution driven, more transactionally focused, like getting things done, which I do think you got some things done, but it lost a lot of like the humanity and human side of stuff. Albeit like that is probably dependent on like how much of the human side you're getting from your work. But I'm curious to like, how do you think about this in like the context of the world generally? It doesn't have to be just with research.
I definitely see that perspective. Like, at least in our lines of work, increasingly you can get more done with fewer people. And if you think about sort of what AI stands for today, it's like an expert across a lot of things that can work for you, or like at least talk to you at the moment. And I think that does have the potential to make your experience lonelier if you like keep tapping into it. But I also sort of see it as like at the end of the day, a lot of what we work on, the things that we do, the things that we have impact on, are framed in the perspective of like other people. Like it might be family, it might be your coworkers, but you know, your existence tends to touch other people. I feel like that's like if like, I don't know, even if you're at a point where like you don't feel like you are touching other people's experiences, there's other people's experiences touching your own, if anything, whether it's you're like consuming the content online, maybe not even in real life next to each other. Inevitably our experiences are all like interconnected. So I feel like there's some framing of it where it's just like AI is just another thing in the mix, another tool in the mix. I feel like the personification gets in the way. Like, you know, there are definitely like some tools that are like on the line of like this is a replacement for a human experience, sort of, or like trying to approach that, like, and I have some opinions about it, but I'm like not certain about. I suppose I'm still figuring out that for myself. I if anything, I don't find it. I see the risk in it. I can totally extrapolate from like what exists today to like, oh, like this could totally lead to like a dystopian version of like, you know, each human to themselves in their own bubble. But like I also see a version where like, you know, it's just another tool. It's like our phones, if anything, yeah, they did have an impact on our lives, but they also like connected us in ways that were like not possible before then.
It's this like this tension between the Promethean myth of fire and, you know, it's like the dual possibility of harm, and everything new always has that dual possibility. But I guess I view a lot of stuff through like the frame of like, you know, we have this wetware, we have a brain, right? And our brain is like, well, we have a brain and a body, if you didn't know. But you know, we have these this body, which is a product of evolution, right? It's a product of millions of years of being shaped through the, what would you say, like the water and the erosion of natural selection, right? And then we also have this brain, right? And the brain was kind of, and the capacity for abstract thought allowed us to break out of the physical plane, so to speak, and start to evolve in the abstract plane of ideas and like this kind of stuff. So we're having sort of like a dual field evolution. And the challenge is that our world of ideas evolves at a much faster rate, right? Because it's not tangibly grounded to the world. And so a lot of times it's like we're sort of these like limited beings in some ways. I mean, there's arguments about like what is limits of human intelligence and all that, but we're like these limited in some sense human beings, and then we're sort of constantly having these increasingly more comprehensive and complex tools that we're challenged with. And it's like the question is like, how do we find meaning or like I don't even know, like belongingness in that experience, because it can feel isolating or alienating when you're like, I can't keep track of all the, and why do we want to be thinking about the future? Most of the time it's because we just want to be positioning ourselves in a way that's either like advantageous or that will survive, right? And any of these things. And so on one hand, like phones did help us connect in a lot of different ways and like launch a lot of different businesses, but they've also had like a cascade of, I guess, downsides and down effects. And it's fascinating to me personally how, and I think this is like maybe a postmodern sort of thing. I think it was like Derrida was this philosopher. He said like there is no difference between the narrative and the real, right?
Mhm.
Postmodernism is like we're sort of hopefully I understand this right, but like there's no difference between everything is a story, right?
Mhm.
And I find it fascinating how the more we go on in time, the more it seems that science fiction and things are pre-leading indicators of what the future will be like. Like
Mhm.
you think it's fiction, but eventually it becomes
Mhm.
fact
Yeah.
in some way. Like think about the movie Her, for example,
Mhm.
right? And I think about that and how with
Yeah.
ChatGPT voice, like
Yeah.
the voice kind of sounds
Yeah.
similar, right? In
Yeah.
some ways. So
That's true. I do feel like especially science fiction and stuff, like there is a sense of like they paint a picture of the future, but that picture also pulls us towards it. Like, you know, the more people that like the number of technologies that like refer to science fiction as like inspiration,
mhm.
uh, like should speak for itself, if anything. Um,
Well, this has also led me to this other question where, because I think all great movements start from art,
mhm.
right? Like when I think about um, Elon's SpaceX, right? We could argue the pros and cons and all that stuff, but the fact that they're trying to go to Mars, like that started from, I think, a project to try to launch like a plant material onto
Mhm.
Mars to kind of inspire, um, more development and research into that kind of thing. And so for me, I always come back to the question of art. And like, it feels like many of our stories don't really tell a promising version of the future,
Mhm.
right? And so I've been for a really long time trying to figure out what's the next art movement, what's the next great art movement that
Mhm.
will kind of inspire us. And so for a while, I didn't go very deep into it, but I quite liked the idea of like solar punk and like this kind
Mm.
of this sort of, I don't know if it was utopian as much, but it was like at least like a synthesis of biology as well as like technology and techno capacity. But it feels like we're in a sort of not like sort of like a cyberpunk, trajectory in some way
Mhm.
where like things are becoming barren and
Yeah.
destroyed and everything's just like you're just gonna love the computer, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, like that's something I've been trying to figure
Yeah.
out if we're gonna go into that direction and how do we create meaning in that sense? Because you're right, like we
Mm.
do it in some way the creation of that idea starts the attractive process to that reality.
Mhm. Yeah. And if anything, you can see a lot of ideas being put out there now of like these narratives of what the future could look like. And at sometimes it feels like the most forceful, powerful one, the loudest one, will be the thing we go towards. And I feel like that's true to a degree, but I
Mhm.
also feel like there's room for uh, like a lot of that spectrum will exist and coexist.
Mhm.
Like there's going to be people that care to only talk to their AI,
Mhm.
let's say, and engage with the world through computers or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, as much as there will be people that like base everything around like the relationships they have with their community or their people.
Mhm.
And I honestly feel like all of those things should coexist, if anything, or I can see all of that coexisting. But I also feel like the main narrative, if anything, would lean some way,
Mhm.
and I don't know exactly what that would be.
Yeah,
Uh,
but these parallel narratives, I mean,
mhm.
that in a way, like that's part of the wonder in some ways of the internet is like sometimes you'll just feel like there is a forum dedicated to making potato guns and like there is a community that feels very deeply
Yeah,
about how to make potato guns
yeah,
properly, and you're like, I didn't even
like
know
yeah,
that this world existed.
hmm
um, and it kind of, I mean, I think sometimes computers and technologies makes the world feel like it's very small or
hmm
smaller than it is.
yeah,
And it's only when you like physically, like if you get on a plane and you're
hmm
like, wow,
yeah.
like this is a big place, and it's much bigger and there's millions of people, and we all want similar things,
hmm
right? So
I also think it's like super, like it's incredibly cool that like if you wanted to, you could live a very specific, like the world is capable of supporting all of these like very small hubs of, or like even at an individual level, if you want to live your life out in a very specific way, like let's say you're an expert in potato guns and like that's what you wanted to do and that's all you did your entire life,
mhm,
somehow the world can sustain it today.
mhm,
I heard this story of like there was a prof at Western who is running like the longest Dungeons and Dragons game.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he has like he's been doing it for like 20, 30 years or
Yeah.
whatever. Has his whole basement converted into that. He's been telling this story. People come from all over the world to. He's like a history prof at Western.
Yeah.
And I feel like he lives in his own world, you know, with like a group of people, and like somehow the world can
Sustain that.
Like
Right.
he doesn't have to worry about like survival.
Mm.
Like he's surviving, and he's like doing his own very specific thing, live out his life doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of awesome too, like to find like you could get obsessed about one very specific thing, live out your entire life doing that, and like you could leave the world, and like you left something, like you were still part of it, you like engaged in it. Like personally, I would say like he's having a very fulfilling life.
What level is his wizard?
Yeah.
You're right, but I think on the other hand, the one thing I do worry about is the almost atomization. Like I think if I was to pull some Jungian like stuff Jung would say, like the atomization of the individual, and like this idea that like today we have to be like hyper specified into one particular thing. It kind of, I think on one hand and one lens, it's beneficial because you can get really, really obsessed into one thing and do one thing for a while. But then it also creates kind of difficulty. Like there's this, I guess the thing in higher education right now where it's like, people, fields are so deep in some level, you kind of feel like it's avant-garde, right? You can't really even have and this is kind of especially with like people who are, I guess, external to academia, then like criticizing, I suppose, like the current developments of like, I don't know, physics or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Where they're like, well, what are the string theorists doing? And the string theorists are like, you're not smart enough to understand, which I'm definitely not. But you know, or like in biology or the development this way. Like the thing I always found so fascinating, I think I read, I can't remember who the author was, but The Philosophy of Science. And it like blew my mind because when you're in school and you're in like grade 9 or something and you open up your algebra textbook and you read this thing like it's gospel, right? Like this is the way that everything is. And then you get to the back and you go to the index and you realize that there's a bunch of research papers. And then you start diving more into the field and you realize that like at the frontier of knowledge, there's actually a lot of insanity, right? Like people really don't know what's going on. And that was the thing for biology that, for example, blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean we don't know how this protein works? Like, how is that possible?
Right. Yeah. I feel like especially education in the future and like figuring out what you want to do or what you want to study, what your interests are going to be like a very each one to themselves kind of game. Because I feel like truly AI does have the capability of like maintaining this like baseline level of education about all of the stuff that matters. Maybe robotics comes into that play and like it becomes more sort of like what is the baseline requirement for like humans to sort of have a decent existence, like have our needs met, and then it like really becomes like a thing of like we don't need high schools to sort of conform people with like this baseline understanding of society, baseline knowledge that you need to exist in like the society that we're building towards. And we sort of have, at least you don't need it to be like a school, you don't need it to be like a program that everybody goes through. Maybe like to a small degree to socialize people, if anything. But figuring out like what things are you curious about and like what exact thing would you want to work on or whatever is going to be such an interesting game.
Well, it's like grown-up Montessori school, right? And I think you're right on some level that at least what the pandemic demonstrated to us was that a lot of formal education was in some way, like a large degree was childcare, right? To be able to functionally go out and work and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I guess like this is another side of it too with, I don't want to say it's like a shift in modality, but today you have a certain basis or canon of knowledge that you understand from high school. It's like all the number of times that you went through and you're like, y equals mx plus b
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
definition of a line, and this is the way it is. Versus, I feel like as you get older and you get into maybe a more fast-paced, maybe fast-paced is not the right word, but the more changing environment, like software or anything like that, where the pace of change is quite often. It's not as much of what you currently know, but it's your capacity to integrate new things as well as like learn them in like a decent time frame. That being said, I do think that like everything is a derivative. Most things are a derivative of other things. So like people who built websites in Web 1.0 like are like, dude, it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Why have we made it so complicated? But we are kind of moving to that world where it is like, at least in software development, you're like, okay, I need to figure out how this containerization stuff works. And then 10 years later, it's like, it still matters to some degree, but your ability to go find articles matters more than remembering that in, 19,
specific thing,
exactly, the factual side of things.
Yeah.
But then I guess at the same time, what happens when nobody remembers the facts anymore, right? And then there's a question of like, what is groundedness? What is truth?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I would think that there is such a thing as like forgotten knowledge for sure, like even as it is today. And I wonder how fundamental that might be.
Well, on one hand, I guess you have like communities and orders. Like, I mean, you like, for example, like in the old, like medieval times, you had like the guilds, right? And they would have certain knowledge,
right?
And I suppose on one level, it's like, I think this was the whole thing with like Freemasonry was like, it's like this group, and you kind of go into it, and they have this one worldview, this one perspective, but it's not really shared to the world. And like similarly, there's like indigenous groups, right, who have very distinct, only members of the community can share in the full breadth of the culture. And it does lead to this question of like, what alternative worlds are we not exposed to, right? From either from a knowledge perspective or from like a culture and that kind of perspective. And on one hand, we can't experience everything, which is like, oh man, that might just be us. No.
I suppose you could take like a first principles perspective on it and be like, okay, there's a foundational rule, and then we can build everything out from those foundational rules. But that doesn't really, like, I feel like culture is way too scattered and nuanced for such a thing to apply.
I mean, maybe like some of Jung's works with archetypes. Like, I feel like that's probably some of the most cross-cutting culture, like intersecting works. Like or even Joseph Campbell, like looking at the different mythologies and seeing how there's this blueprint, so to speak, that keeps being regenerated, but with different colors and different costumes and different characters, right? But functionally speaking, there's this generative blueprint that's like the basis. I mean, my understanding of Jung is that in some ways these archetypes are sort of like the actual players of the game, and we're sort of the costumes, right? Like we're sort of at this will of like this ever infinite narrative between all these archetypes, and we merely, are just embodiments of a different preference towards those archetypes. But we have the sort of the we put the tail on the wrong side of the dog because we think that we're the agents of our lives, right? So, but yeah, I think with regard to culture, I mean, that would be our closest maybe approximation of like, what is the essential similarity? I mean, from a biology perspective, I think like the statistic is 99.7% of our DNA is like the same, right? But it's like 30 basis points is the differentiation, and like that very minute amount of DNA creates that diversity. But at the same time, when we do investigate one another, we realize, like, functionally speaking, we pretty much all want similar things, right? To be happy, to be loved, to feel belonging, to feel growth, satisfaction, etc. Maybe people are trying to do it in different ways, but, and in some ways, like the modality by which we think we need to accomplish that is in some ways like polluted by the influences that we're exposed to.
That's true.
And like the process is just sort of like figuring out how to do this in our own individual way, or embody that in our own individual way.
Yeah, that resonates.
This conversation became very philosophical. So I guess we could probably wrap around here.
Sure.
Is there anything you want to share with us about UNMS and where you're developing forward research? You can share your Twitter, even though
I am working on a bunch of things, primarily research, and I've been working on this thing called Signal over the last few weeks, and all of that stuff you can see at un.ms. Yeah.
Udara's new media studio, right?
Yes. Yeah. I was still just like reflecting on what you were talking about.
Yeah, for the people who I guess are listening to this, me and Udara, we tend to have very open-ended conversations that tend to lean towards the existential.
Yeah.
Mostly a product of me, but that's just my personality. But cool. Well, Udara, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your journey and all that stuff, and getting into, I guess, a little bit more of the weeds. And hopefully we can connect again, not in 8 years, but have another conversation on the podcast. So with that being said, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll catch you in the next episode.